Chapter 9 Sardines and a Camera. We opened our eyes to the constant swaying of our hammocks. Every Indian that went past pushed against the nets and made them swing. Still, no streak of light filtered through the low, narrow opening of the hut, yet men and women were going in and out, busily engaged in the duties of the hour. Once more the mud pots were seething and bubbling over the central fire. Around it, on their haunches, a number of Indian women were crowded, tending the meal or adding wood to the blaze. Most of them were young, with vivacious expressions and pleasing features, although for one reason or another they did not conform to the style of beauty esteemed by civilized peoples. Some because they had big mouths and thick lips, others because they had broad, flat noses, or for the simple reason that their faces were homogeneous and had nothing distinguishing about them. Their appearance was not well cared for, and could not be so, for manipulating blackened firebrands had quickly spoilt any idea they might have had of feminine coquetry. The chief was sitting very stiffly on a mat. He must have painted himself very recently, for he positively gleamed with uricum. On a kind of plate made of woven palm fiber were heaped some large green pods. He skillfully flicked them open one by one with his thumbnail and conveyed them to his mouth in a rapid movement. He was devoting exceedingly close attention to this operation, and was apparently taking no notice of three of his sons who were talking to him persistently. Every now and then he stopped chewing and answered them imperiously. His wives were watching him in silence. He realized that I was observing him, for the coldness in his eyes changed, and they became less harsh. At the same time he quickened the tempo of his eating, which made me smile. Possibly those pods were scarce, and he was fond of them. He did not want to risk having to invite me to share them. Two captains came in and placed themselves at his side. Not until he had finished eating did the chief attend to them. The savants, like most wild tribes, do not have any fixed hours for meals. They partake of food whenever they have an appetite for it, except during famine or with the approach of lean times for the tribe. Then they reveal their incredible stamina. Both in the way they gorge themselves with food when it abounds, and in their ability to survive without it in times of shortage. This was a splendid opportunity for studying them, for their attention was concentrated upon the pots of food which their womenfolk were providing. The women always waited until the men had finished eating before they helped themselves. The only ones who put their hands into the pots, and who even at times took the mouthful a warrior himself was about to eat, were the little boys. This behavior was not censured either by the man or the woman. On the contrary, it made them smile. They knew that the small boy, now at their side, their own son, would belong to them only until he was 7 or 8 years old. Then he would enter into the life of the tribe and become a part of it, and would have to conform to it and to the iron-bound tradition which would cost him so much in effort and sacrifice to learn. The women were busy at their tasks, serving food for their menfolk, suckling their babies, fetching wood and water, arranging the mats and baskets, putting aside food for the next morning's and midday meals, or going out to gather various wild fruits, mending fiber bags, or selecting the leaves of certain reeds to make bowstrings, or crushing the fruit from which the uricum is extracted. Meanwhile, the warriors occupied themselves with their personal hygiene, or overhauled and polished their weapons. They painstakingly combed their long hair with combs of straight thorns, touched up the paint on their bodies, or played with the children. There was no doubt that we found ourselves living among a warrior tribe where woman is invariably relegated to secondary plane. Suddenly, a sixth sense told me that someone was observing me. I turned in my hammock to look, and a warrior, who was another of the chief's sons, sprang up and hurried away to the exit of the hut, but not before he had given me a look of profound disdain. He was an exceptional person, well worthy of special study. He must have been 6 feet tall at least, and had the symmetrically muscular frame proper to one who has devoted himself to physical culture rather than to hard work. Besides these qualities, which marked him out as a great hunter, what impressed me was the heritage of proud bearing in his aggressive attitude. Throughout my long sojourn with this tribe, this particular member of it shunned me openly, and always with the same hostility. My mind seemed to be conspiring to complicate every situation. I just did not know what attitude I ought to adopt in facing up to the savants, and I was afraid that any blunder on our part would be fatal. I was dreading getting out of the hammock. What was I to do? What should I say? I waited until several warriors went out, and then grasped the opportunity of getting down. The Indians appeared not to have noticed it, only to cast a look of indifference in my direction. Feeling more reassured, I woke Norma and confided in her what I had been thinking. She did no more than indicate, with a slight movement of her head, one corner of the hut, and my new-found confidence collapsed. A young Indian woman with cropped hair, the one who had suckled the puppy at her breast, was looking daggers at me with an intense, savage expression in her eyes. I pretended not to see her, but when I picked up a vessel of water to wash with, she snatched it out of my hands and carried it away. It all happened in a matter of seconds before the stupor of it could take possession of me. A curt order given by the chief and a murmur caused the Indian girl to hand me back the same vessel. Yet the apprehension of the night before again took hold of me. What a dope I had been to think that the tribal council's acceptance of us would make us part of the tribe. There was an enormous task ahead of us to win the trust of the natives, and it was going to be anything but easy. After breakfast we left the hut. Immediately an armed warrior dogged our footsteps. In my heart of hearts I felt safer. I still remembered those old men and the very young ones who at the meeting of the tribal council had displayed murderous hankerings. Norma, however, did not care for this kind of surveillance, and certainly if looks could kill, that warrior would have dropped stone dead. There was a manifest cleanliness about the place, except for the excrement of the Indians, which was lying around everywhere. The mental sensitivity of the native is directed essentially to the practical. Hence, unaware of hygiene advantages, his primitive customs in this respect do not trouble or worry him in the least. The warrior who was looking after us showed a particularly ready intelligence, for without our asking him, he pointed to a place in the undergrowth and said, "Og, water." 100 yards away, a cold, crystalline stream came down from the mountains. When we reached the shady thicket, a group of little boys joined us. We liked the silent, prudent manner in which they were following us. If we stopped, they stopped too. When we washed our feet in the stream, they looked at our lower limbs one by one, and then at their own to see if they were alike. This was accompanied by whispered laughs and exclamations. Their hair was long, and they carried bows and arrows. Their ages would be between 5 and 10. They all, without exception, had remarkably white teeth, which they displayed at the slightest opportunity, and restlessly inquisitive eyes, such as I had never seen before. They gave us the impression that they were speaking to us with their looks. The warrior ordered them to go away. They ran off and hid in the jungle, and then, after a while, low branches parted gently to enable those greedy, black, sparkling eyes to see us again. Invariably, if we ran into the women fetching water or gathering firewood, they became angry and turned their backs on us. My wife made fun of them by exclaiming, "Peepadi, dangerous," suggesting that we were something they were scared of, which intrigued them so much that some of them, in spite of their simulated irritation, smiled, though in doing so they put a hand over their mouths. As we drew near to the chief's hut, the children disappeared as if by magic. In the jungle we saw no warriors. Evidently they must have eluded us. We might have been only a yard away from them, for they had skill in concealing themselves. Our equipment was just as we left it. Nobody had touched a single thing, not even the most trivial. Some people believe that natives have a special predilection for firearms and cannot resist stealing them. As far as the savants are concerned, of the parent village anyway, nothing could be farther from the truth. As a test and a psychological study, I covered the butt and barrel of the carbine with a thin film of Vaseline. There was not a single finger mark upon it to show that it had been touched. The humid heat and the smoke of the dying fire made the atmosphere of the hut extremely heavy. Optimistically, we prepared a meal. The dust which was kicked up by the Indians' feet as they came in and out covered our equipment again. We had to wash the plates, cups, and cooking utensils repeatedly and protect them with a plastic sheet while we were cooking the food. On one of the mats, in an aggressive attitude, lay the Indian girl with the cropped hair as a sign of mourning. Her appearance and attitude reflected the cult of the savage. She was young, about 18 years of age, slender of figure, and with agreeable features, semi-Mongolian in type. Her lack of hair hardened her face, but apart from that, her feminine attributes were not unpleasing. She watched us incessantly. She was the chief's eldest daughter. She was caressing the little dog and letting it nibble at her breast, only to give it a hefty blow with the flat of her hand and sent it rolling away from her. To Norma's smiles she replied with an indifference that was studiedly insulting. Our saucepan was besieged by the women of the hut. Each one of them who approached lifted the lid and sniffed the contents. One woman fished up some spaghetti, and showing it to her companions remarked, "Ah, tea, a worm," which caused them all to laugh. They really thought we were cooking worms, and the idea caused us to join in the laughter. As soon as they saw us enjoying the joke, they shut up. We had to make do with a poor meal of seasoned spaghetti, while all around us was wafted the appetizing smell of roast meat. Nobody had invited us to visit them, and no one would have dreamt of offering us meat. The chief's daughter had changed her frowning expression and was smiling at her husband, who was also young. He was a slim, genial-looking warrior with an amiable countenance. As soon as I caught his eye, he smiled at me. I informed Norma of this event, but it was too late. His wife was ticking him off, and his face changed at once. He ate maize cooked in the embers, palm fruit, and chunks of meat offered him by his wife. It was agony to remain in the hut. The breeze caused a perpetual draught of smoke. No sooner had we washed our faces, eyes, and noses than our handkerchiefs were black with smuts again. With an effort, we got our frugal meal down and decided to eat the raspadura dessert outside. The same Indian followed us again. He showed no irritation or rancor at having been appointed our warder. Whenever I looked at him, he always pretended to be interested in something far away. He was evidently trying to show us that his new job was subsidiary to his rank as a warrior, and consequently that as far as he was concerned we were of no importance whatever. We walked towards the shelter of some trees with dense foliage, but we were not alone. The band of boys, now enlarged by several more, followed our movements and were forming a group, cheek to cheek, so as not to miss a single detail of what we were doing. Norma and I agreed to try to intrigue them into coming closer. We pretended to be passing something to each other in our clenched fists. As we made these passing movements, the expectant, smiling curiosity of the children turned to puzzlement. We found it difficult not to laugh ourselves, but with patience we persisted in our efforts. One boy, somewhat older than the rest, about 10 years of age, took a step forward as if fascinated. Another boy followed him. Just as we thought we were successfully overcoming their timidity, the warrior intervened and made me open my hand. The clicking of his tongue was harshly significant. He was angry at having been tricked, and he put on a sullen expression. The boys burst out laughing, and instead of running away, they surrounded us. When we spoke to them, however, none of them answered at our question. "Ah, si, what is your name?" They shook their heads vigorously and closed their mouths. Thus the afternoon went by. When we showed an interest in them, they shunned us. When we ignored them, they sought us. The hour was approaching when all the tribe engaged in revelries. The heat continued in full vigor for a time, then the sun sank suddenly in clouds and hid behind the Roncador Mountains. Now nearly all the hunters had returned, and the village had become a hive of activity, in contrast to its tranquility before. The boys and smaller children were running about and playing games with some split coconuts, and others came back with baskets full of grasshoppers, which they caught with sticks, and which, when roasted, were highly esteemed as a delicacy. The women went out to take the air, which was rapidly becoming colder, and then, squatting against the walls of the huts, were breastfeeding their babies, weaving baskets, delousing each other's hair, or eating toasted maize. The warriors, on emerging from their huts, were sprucely combed and painted, and carried spears as their only weapons. Wearing a deerskin over their shoulders, each of them belonged to a different clan. As if their voices had been trained by an exacting and competent choirmaster, a powerful choir of some 20 Indians thundered a guttural chant. Their voices rose and fell in intensity, the tones modulated with accuracy and discipline. Loud, piercing notes were followed by soft, long, drawn-out notes. Instead of from a score of throats, one had the sensation that the chant was coming from a single one. Such was the perfection of their synchronizing. The Da Pramba was beginning, the dance or chant of evening, but instead of being performed by a whole group, there were only 3 who went all around the village singing. They were young warriors who, though married, had no children yet. As the chief passed by, he left his escort of warriors and came up to me. He laid a hand on my shoulder and repeated twice, "Sawidi." After the experience that day with the other Indians, I found his friendliness moving. For some reason unknown to me, the chief had taken a liking to us. Later I was to learn the reason. It was obvious that, despite his wife's warnings against us, the husband of the chief's daughter wished to make friends with us. I decided not to try to precipitate matters one way or the other, and left him to sort the thing out in his own way. Before I looked at him, I observed his wife to see whether she approved of her husband's action. She did not. She lay huddled against the wall of the hut with her back to us. I admired the courage of the young man and his indifference to her remonstrances. He offered me a small fiber bag, and pointing to the spaghetti, he told me it was no good. I thanked him for the gift and took the opportunity of asking the hereto fruitless question, "Ah, si, what's your name? Literally, what do you call yourself?" He answered me with a readiness I did not expect and which struck me as irrefutably logical. He said he did not call himself anything, that it was others who called him by his name, and therefore I should consult others and not him. I made up my mind that I would at least find out his wife's name. He whispered it in my ear so softly that I could hardly hear it. The name of his ill-tempered consort was Piochi. I imagined the little bag would contain meat, which would enable us to save our can of whatever it was till the next day. Imagine my disillusionment to find there was nothing inside it but some long fat worms wriggling incessantly. Thinking that we had a liking for worms, our warrior friend had made us a delightfully thoughtful present. Prayna, the husband of that irresistible girl, the chief's daughter, was to become a valuable link between our world and his. I don't know why he tried to make friends with us, although I suspected that it was to keep on the right side of his powerful father-in-law. But the proximity of our living quarters to theirs was a stimulus to friendlier relations. He showed an interest in our equipment down to the smallest detail, and invariably as soon as his wife went out of the hut, he would come to us and enter into conversation. He was very intelligent and possessed of an uncommon vivacity. His intuition enabled him to grasp something of my ethnological interest, and he even said he appreciated it and thought it quite natural, and when I asked him a question, he would often in his turn ask me something too. We had quite lengthy chats sometimes in which mimicry, gestures, and drawings frequently helped out my scant vocabulary. Suddenly he would break off and leave us, a sure sign that Biochi, his wife, was coming back. It was in this way that we found out a fundamental fact, which weighed heavily in providing an explanation as to why the chief tolerated us, allowed us to remain, and spared our lives. Some 30 moons before, he held up both hands 3 times in succession to convey the number. The tribal council had imposed its will upon the chief. The elders of the tribe had wanted to go to a certain region to hunt, and the chief had opted for another. At last he had given way to the will of the council for hunting parties that went to the place the council recommended confirmed that it was better than the other. This difference of opinion had been seemingly lived down, like so many others, until one day an accident occurred which cost the life of a member of the chief's family. This warrior became ill after a surfeit of meat, which had undoubtedly gone bad, and died shortly afterwards in terrible pain. The chief pronounced his verdict that the death was due to witchcraft and ordered the infliction of a suitable act of vengeance. In these cases, the tribal council has no right to intervene, the chief's authority being absolute. The group appointed to avenge the crime promptly carried out the sentence. They killed with spears made of hard wood of a tree root an elder of the tribe, a member of the tribal council, his son, his son's wife, and 2 children, thus eliminating a whole family to prevent a further act of vengeance. By sanctioning our visit, the chief wanted to demonstrate his authority over the tribal council. I inquired as to who had carried out the death sentence, for he would be sure to be an extremely interesting character. Prayna shut up like a clam. I presumed that his better half was in sight, but it was not so. The chief was beside us. While I smiled at him, I tried to discover hidden traces of cruelty in his face, but I could see nothing but sincerity and intelligence. He sniffed at what we were eating and uttered an approving That was as much as to say that he expected to be invited to share with us just when we were cooking a mere handful of rice, which, with the second last can of preserves we had been hoarding like gold dust since the wreck. Repressing what we really thought, for he had plenty of food for himself, we served him a plateful, as all the tribe ate with their fingers. We did not offer him a fork. He immediately asked for one, to let us see that the white man's customs presented no difficulty. To a savant, to my surprise, he used it quite properly. His personality was too important for us to overlook any detail of it. He partook of the food in silence and with deliberation. When he had finished, he handed my wife the plate and belched. He got up, and taking me by the arm, he led me to his mat, where several Indians were waiting for him. I thought he was going to reciprocate by offering me some edible pods or beans, but he evidently appreciated food more than I. The warriors made room for me, and we all reclined on the mat. He embraced me and repeated 3 times his familiar "Sawidi." Then he turned to face one of the captains. My ear was still slow to adapt itself to such a guttural dialect. Nevertheless, I managed to grasp what they were talking about. One of the chief's sons, whose name was Paridi, was engaged in exploration some 6 days' march away in search of suitable hunting grounds. The captain was complaining that the young men were dissatisfied because they could not get enough meat. His clan was of the opinion that the site of the village no longer served the needs of the tribe. This news made me uneasy. I had imagined until that moment that in the parent tribe we should not want for anything. I was so absorbed in making out the highly significant things they were saying that I did not realize that the chief was closely watching me. He suddenly sprang on me the question whether game was plentiful where the great birds flew. In this way he referred to Zavantina, where the military airplanes landed. When I said yes, he scowled and pointed to the hammocks. Rather stung by his abruptness, I left him. I could not see the reason for his reaction, but there certainly was one. He had not known that I understood his language, and he was annoyed at my having found out about the hardships of his tribe, me a white man. That was why he always said nothing but "Sawidi" to me, thinking it was the only thing I understood and appreciated. The plague of children that followed us around incessantly was becoming a nuisance. They imagined they saw in us outstanding beings markedly different from their own people. Their curiosity irritated me, especially when I went behind a bush to attend to my necessities. I made use of all the interjections and threats that I knew in their language, without effect. On the contrary, I believe that the more effort I made, the more it excited their interest. They supposed, and inwardly I agreed with them, that if to do something perfectly natural I took such precautions, it evidently was because I must be in some way made differently. Our relationship suffered a momentary deadlock. We were up against their lack of respect for the white man. Here we were without the support of an exemplary figure such as we had had in the previous village, and the missionary who, by his personality and character, gave dignity to civilized men. Usually we lunched in the shelter of the jungle on the banks of one of the creeks of the stream which supplied the village with water, and we stayed there until the temperature abated. At that hour there was nothing interesting going on in the chief's hut, and our sphere of activity was limited to that. It would have been imprudent to visit the other huts without the chief or a member of one of the families concerned. We lit a fire of very resinous wood, heated the food, and bathed to our heart's content. The injuries we had sustained still bothered us and did not heal. To bathe, I had to put a boulder in the current, which enabled me to keep my injured leg out of the water. Very often I lost patience, and I lathered and washed the wounds until they bled copiously. No antibiotic or ointment from our well-stocked medicine chest had any effect. Norma tried not to worry me about the sore places she had on her own leg. The mesh of the sleeping net rubbed the injuries during the night and caused them to reopen. The dust, the heat, and the sun's rays made her suffer cruelly during the day. For my part, I found this slight problem, which would have been practically negligible in a civilized environment, really disquieting. It was an irritation which began afresh every day at the least graze or abrupt movement, and had to be stoically borne in order to enable us to confront the delicate business of dealing with these wants with equanimity. Over and over again we tried to get away from the children, to have a day's peace. We would go out separately, hiding the food inside our shirts or our pith helmets so as not to arouse their interest. We would go first in one direction and then another. In the end we would have to give it up. Invariably when we set up camp we would hear a laugh somewhere, then another and another, until the bushes parted and 10 or 15 kids appeared, spying on us unashamedly. The warrior now no longer watched us from close by, although we knew he was still there, a few paces away in the thicket, observing us. The boys' vitality was exasperating. They never relinquished their vigil. We cudgeled our brains to find a way to make friends with them. The nearest they came to us was about 2 yards distant, always ready to run away whenever we took no notice and turned our backs on them. They would laugh and make fun of us, or would stand still like statues, fixing their gaze on the napes of our necks. It was difficult to keep a sense of proportion. We did not want to drive them away, but neither did we wish them to take liberties, which would only spoil the chance of getting them to like us later on. I put my faith in a can of sardines. There comes a time in a male savant's life which is the most important and decisive moment. It is when he passes out of the stage of the future warrior, wasp-step recruit, into that of the full-fledged warrior. This stage is generally reached by the time the boy is 15, when his instructors give their approval of his assimilation of the complex and painstaking lessons which a young warrior has to undergo. Then the lobes of their ears are pierced and 2 sticks are inserted, which entitles them to be recognized as active members of the tribe and to marry. My attention was concentrated on a robust boy, 13 years of age at the most, who was sitting on a fallen tree trunk. The lobes of his ears were already pierced with sticks. Swinging a leg and leaning on his bow, he stared at us defiantly. His body was painted red, and his calves with black stripes. The group of boys included one who we nicknamed Clown. He always twisted his words around to make his buddies laugh. If I asked him to tell me what the sun was called, which was Buta, he'd reply Bobota. I expressed to him mild praise of the young warrior's bearing, and of his having become a warrior so young. I assumed that as he was about the same age he would feel jealous. I was not mistaken. His smiling expression changed, and his eyes flashed. He murmured very softly, so that the other should not hear, that he was not really a warrior, and that the sticks in the earlobes were due to the influence of one of the captains. My question took him unawares. "Ah, si, what is his name?" He answered, "No Tenawa," which was the name of the boy warrior. Following up the plan I had conceived, I raised my voice, and calling him by his name, I invited him to come over. The effect was unforeseen. He sprang down from the tree trunk, and bending the bow, aimed an arrow at my informant. Before I could intervene, the arrow plunged into the ground a few inches from the boy's feet. No Tenwa prepared to shoot another arrow. I stood between them, but owing to his hard expression and compressed lips, I felt it wiser to say that the chief would know how to punish him if he did not conduct himself like a true warrior. He lowered his bow, and with slow, measured steps he strode away from us amid the barking and howling of the boys as they made fun of him. As the mocking cries died down, the silence became embarrassing. The kids were grateful to me, and their former cockiness turned into bashfulness, as if nothing had happened. Norma took out the can of sardines and showed it to them. Unceremoniously and fearlessly the children surrounded us, and for the first time rubbed shoulders with us. When they saw the sardine can with the picture on it, one of them said, "TB, fish." We opened it, and an outburst of incredulity, signs, and tongue-clickings greeted the sight and smell of the sardines. The can was passed from hand to hand. The meal proved far from satisfying to us, for 13 guests had invited themselves to lunch. But anyway, we found a great sense of happiness to have penetrated into an unspoilt virgin world, such as it had seemed certain no longer existed. By being surrounded by these savant children was destined to be, to my mind, one of the pleasantest of our memories. The chief was fascinated by the notebooks in which we recorded data and by the signed cameras. Generally he appeared completely unannounced. His footsteps were so silent that it was more likely that we should hear his breathing than his walking. His expression, usually severe, became troubled at the sight of the notebooks, and he asked me to show them to him. He thumbed through the pages 2 or 3 times, assenting with an emphatic each time. When he came to the blank pages, he pointed to the pencil and the notebook and imitated that I should write something. When I explained what I used them for, he understood at once. He compared the notebooks with the spoken orders which he gave his henchmen to take to their tribal brothers in other villages, and asked how it was I had no important news to put into messages on the vacant pages if all the neighboring tribes depended upon these savants. I assured him that everything I was learning about his powerful tribe was in the notebook. He clicked with his tongue and shook his head. He gave me back the notebook and told me to follow him. I informed Norma of what was going on. She was always ready for the unexpected, and we followed the chief. Our new friends, the boys, who never came very close to the chief's hut, when they saw us accompanying him, disbanded and fled in all directions. The chief strode swiftly along an out-of-the-way path. Lianas and protruding trunks which obstructed it showed that it was little used, but he sprung cleanly over the obstacles without slackening his rapid pace. We skirted the characteristic reddish soil scattered with weeds and stunted coppices at the double, and as we advanced along the fringe of taller vegetation of stout trees which seemed to have been scorched in a fire, the chief came to a halt and raised his muscular arm pointed ahead with a triumphant air. I could not place the stretch of broad, flat land which extended for several hundred yards. The only signs of occupation of that prepared ground were the great coppice ant-hills 6 feet high. As I looked closer, I made out large rocks and a number of stony mounds scattered over the ground. My heart almost stopped beating with excitement. Could it be possible that this was some important and unique savant burial ground? How many exhumations could be carried out, and what a wealth of scientific data they would yield? For a moment my rambling thoughts did not connect with what the chief was saying to me. In grave tones he was telling me that many, many moons before, the great bird of the white man had descended here to bring him Apona. For the first time he revealed to me personally his tribal name, Raspadura, and many gifts. Now he had destroyed with stones what he had once built at the white man's request, because the white man, his gifts, and his birds were on D, bad for the tribe. Then he told me that the peacemaker Francisco Mireles had requested the famous Zavant chief to level this plot of ground for the transport of gifts. It was considered, and is still considered, that the Zavant's acquiescence was the greatest triumph ever attained by the specialized agencies of Brazil. Pimentel Barbosa, an official of the Indian Protection Service, was the first white man to make contact with a group of Zavant warriors from the parent village. A few days after the announcement, he was killed, with 6 of his companions, by those same Zavants. Later their bodies were found with all their bones broken, 1,000 yards from the River of the Dead, with the Zavant spears beside them. After this dramatic event, nobody achieved any effective contact for a considerable time. For years the gifts flown in and deposited on the west bank of the River of the Dead were found later, riddled by arrows, and with their contents untouched. In 1946, Francisco Mireles had the satisfaction, after laborious and dangerous preparatory work, of succeeding in persuading the Zavants to accept gifts without hiding themselves or attacking. Shortly afterwards, his perseverance and goodwill were rewarded, and he visited the parent village for a few days, at the end of which he was obliged to leave by order of the chief. This pacific interchange was tolerated for a while. Then the Zavant spirit lost interest in the gifts, and they prohibited white men, except Francisco Mireles, from setting foot in their territory. And so energetic and determined was their bellicose attitude that one personality, Brigadier Raimundo de Vasconcelos Abraham, now a member of the National Indian Council of Brazil and an admirer of the Indians, had to resign himself to forego a visit to the parent village and its legendary chief, under penalty of risking an armed uprising of the Zavant tribes. This situation had persisted up to our advent on the scene. My disappointment that this was not an Indian cemetery vanished at the sight of the chief's attitude, his eyes gleaming at the recollection, his bow raised menacingly, and his body vibrant with energy and rippling muscles. He said time and time again, "White man bad, gifts bad, bird bad." Scattered about and half buried in the landing ground were all kinds of utensils, rusted metal saucepans, picks and shovels, and a sort of sharpened blade for clearing the undergrowth. The chief was calm again. Then he ordered me, rather than suggested, "Give this message to your tribe." The dry season was setting in, and with it the verdant foliage, and the shoots on bushes and trees were disappearing. Nature was tenting and bringing to fruition the plant life that months before had thrust itself out from the landscape. Now there was a desert-like aridity of rock and brick-red earth, burnished a deep gold under the cruel intensity of the sun's rays. The nights did not now bring the icy cold we had endured formerly. The thermometer did not drop to 41 or 45, it stood between 50 and 60, even though the average temperature in the daytime fluctuated between 113 and 122. Our adaptation to the climate was a very slow process. This was in part owing to our precarious and insufficient diet. Jams and other sweetmeats, preserves, and compounds rich in vitalizers had been used up prematurely, since we had run short of our staple foods like rice, beans, and dried peas, and game which I had relied on had not been forthcoming in sufficient quantity. Hunting parties would leave the village while the stars were still visible and come back at sundown, 2 days later, crestfallen and speechless, with their baskets almost empty. At such times the tribe subsisted mainly on broken brown beans, which abounded naturally. In the absence of meat from their diet, other foods filled their empty bellies. Grasshoppers, a certain kind of boa constrictor, various species of ants, worms, armadillos, fishes, wild potatoes, palm fruit, palm shoots, honey, maize, and all the edible fruits in the area, such as murishi, Pecoy, and Jatoba. If a solitary hunter bagged a specimen of game, the primitive tribal law that governed them accorded him the full right of possession and did not require him to make any contribution towards mitigating the general hunger. His fellow tribesmen did not envy him his good fortune, but on the contrary paid tribute to his skill as a hunter and congratulated him on his prize. No member of the tribe was obliged to look after another. Their code was strict and proud. No savant would ever ask for such assistance, for to do so would be to acknowledge that he was unworthy of his reputation as a warrior, which he valued more than life itself. Automatically they applied these canons to us. Also, contrary to our expectations, life in the village was becoming more and more exigent and beset with hunger. One morning I made out in the sand on the bank of the stream the hoof print of a deer of some kind. As furtively as possible I took up my carbine and we left the village. The soft soil made our tracking easy. We walked as silently as we could along the bank of the stream. Every bramble, thorn, or tree trunk in our way caused us to make complicated maneuvers so as not to reveal ourselves, even wading through the cold water up to our waists. I don't know how long we spent searching in this way, but all we seemed to have got out of it was lacerated, swollen feet and torn clothes, and we were completely out of breath. We took advantage of the sun filtering through close-woven greenery which fed upon the stream, and we sat down to rest in its cool shade. Immediately we noticed the smell of roast meat which brought a curse to my lips. A hunter more fortunate than I had snatched the game from under my nose. For some few seconds I felt the caveman stirring within me. I was ready to grab that meat even if I had to fight for it. We followed the alluring scent. No Tenawa, that young and ill-tempered boy warrior, was roasting a baby stag. If I had had any hope of being invited to share the meal, they vanished as soon as I saw who the hunter was. He looked at us with a very solemn face and put some more branches on the fire. Then I acted unthinkingly, without weighing up the situation. I was carried away by the aroma of the venison. I offered to swap 3 bullets to adorn his necklace for a quarter of the animal he had caught. I knew that the bullets were highly prized, for they were considered as weapons of the white man, and to be able to display them would indicate his superiority. He assented on one condition, that when I gave him the bullets I should tell him my name. In this way he was trying to soothe his injured pride. The explanation-wise avant warriors are exceedingly reluctant to tell anyone their names lies in the very fact of their isolated existence, for one who knows them must perforce be some friend or acquaintance of the tribe. I did as he asked, and Norma joined us. We were forthwith joined by someone else, the warrior whose job it was to keep his eye on us all the time. He leant upon his bow, and without even asking for it was given a joint of venison by No Tenawa. What a hope on my part to imagine that my furtiveness had eluded the zealous savant. The boy warrior said not a word more, and I did not encourage him to do so. When he had finished the meal, he carefully wrapped up the remains in palm leaves and left. We had never before ventured so far afield to keep out of the shade and avoid the brambles. We moved away from the stream, and soon we came across a glen, free of overhanging trees, and descended gradually towards the village. The overwhelming heat soon made us long for the shadows we shunned, for the reflection from the very stones caused us to blink incessantly. Suddenly we caught the sound of voices shouting, "He-ho! He-ho!" ascending the ravine at the double. A single file of boys was being drilled by an instructor. They were painted black all over, although sweat and dust had made inroads on their blackened bodies, and each wore a band of invira around his head. Each carried on his left shoulder a green tree trunk, which, although not very large, was too big and heavy for boys so young. They showed signs of exhaustion. As they came level with us, they were puffing and blowing like punctured bellows. These were our little friends, those smiling, laughing jokers who right now were behaving like real potential warriors. They greeted us and went on their way up the slope. The shoulders of some of them were torn and bleeding under the weight and friction of the tree trunks. We felt proud of them, proud of being able to number them among our friends, and even a little ashamed of having thought of them as mere fledglings. Ureta and Fabre had gone. 2 or 3 times they had approached us unenthusiastically, for they knew that we were being watched. One morning, when I was bathing in the river, Ureta slipped noiselessly down to me, beside me, and handing me 2 pigeons and 3 arrows, he murmured, "Sawidi," and made off. This was his farewell, worthy of a brave warrior. After that, I did not see them any more in the village. Their going left us more alone than ever, and conscious of a certain sense of sad loss. Fabre was destined to play a highly significant part in events that were later to occur in the village on the River of the Dead, where the mission stood. Almost a year after our departure from it, the warrior set fire to the village and part of the mission itself, attributing to the evil spirits of the white man the misfortune of having lost his wife and his son at the same time. Later, with a small band of followers, he went to the tribe of the chief Babati, whose village was to the west of Zavantina, where no white man had ever set foot, and there he joined forces with a group from that tribe and took part in the attack in 1958 on Kokalino, an important hamlet on the borders of Goais. He has now become a respected tribal captain. In part, this information was given me personally during his visit to Montevideo by the stoical missionary Father Pedro Spardellato, who had taken us down the River of the Dead. The rest was fully reported in the international press. Wherever I went, I invariably took with me one of the sign cameras. They were cumbersome to carry about, especially if, as in our case, one had to depend solely on one's own labor. To fetch water or gather firewood, I was obliged to perform precarious balancing tricks, which sometimes defeated their own object. However, I bore these inconveniences, if not with the best grace, at least with a stoical fortitude. Upon these cameras depended the real success of the expedition. 2 reasons impelled me always to carry one of them about with me. Firstly, the tribe had grown accustomed to seeing me with them, and associated them with me as an inseparable accompaniment, which therefore did not awaken their suspicion. The second reason, which I regarded as more important, was so that I should be always ready to film any scene of interest that might present itself. With the tribe of Zavantina, and with somewhat more difficulty with the tribe on the banks of the River of the Dead, we had managed up to a point to carry out our intentions, but here our attempts were frustrated by the fears of the children, the irritation of the women, and the aggressive pride of the warriors, to whom the camera was some sort of weapon. They could not conceive of anything being pointed at them except an attack, for when they themselves aimed at someone it was to kill. Just raising the camera was enough to make the children near me stop what they were doing and run away. The more courageous of them faced up to it grimly, as though it were some implacable enemy. They tossed their heads, threw back their shoulders, and glared defiantly at the lens. In the face of this demonstration of resolute goodwill, there was nothing for it but to start the thing, and consequently waste a few feet of valuable unexposed film, just so as not to discourage the plucky youngsters. Every evening, when there was no longer enough light for filming, I gave up searching for subjects. I cleaned the lenses thoroughly, unable to bear the thought of what a complete flop my trip was from the point of view of making a film. My notes on Zavant sociology were accumulating, and still I had not used one single roll of film for photographing the Zavants' life in their parent village. The women would not tolerate the sign camera, hours of interminable waiting in paths and byways where I knew they had to pass at the stream or in the spots where the palm tree grew, from which they obtained the palmitos and the leaves they used for many household purposes, ended in frustration as they broke into sudden angry flight, or with crushing scorn told me to get that thing out of the way. As for the warriors, I had no illusions. Their sense of hearing was so fantastically acute that not even with a telescopic lens could I manage to take them by surprise. Not understanding the reason for my presence, they showed signs of irritation as soon as I undid the catch of the case containing the camera. I do not know what would have happened if I had made any pretense of focusing the camera upon them. I was not going to try to find out. The savants belongs to a class of warriors given to making instantaneous decisions, and I would surely not have been in the land of the living by the time I attempted to assure him I was only fooling. Since his passionate outburst against white men, the day he took me to the landing ground, the chief had become more friendly and solicitous. At midday he came to see us while we were resting in our hammocks and tasted the marvelous thick stew Norma was cooking. Then he asked amicably about the message, as he called them, meaning my notebooks, and went away. Later, when we had lunch, I returned his visit, causing him to swallow his beans hastily. Several times I tried on purpose to find out whether he would offer me any. He always ignored my presence. His face, as if carved in stone, remained solemn, and he appeared to be absorbed in grave problems, while his jaws worked frantically. As soon as none of his cherished kidney beans were left, he smiled at me, and patting the mat, invited me to sit down. His shamelessness delighted me. That afternoon I made up my mind to take advantage of his friendly disposition, and I explained to him the inconvenience I was faced with in being unable to make use of the sign camera, which I said was really more important than the notebooks. He turned his eyes away from me and let his gaze wander around the hut. It was obvious that he was in a quandary. I guessed that he was racking his brains in his effort to understand. He certainly was not anxious to collaborate. He did not like the sign camera either. In accordance with a prearranged plan, I made a sign to Norma, and she came over with some magazines containing photographs of Indians. We had brought these illustrated magazines with us because we had a pretty good idea they might come in useful one day to explain something when words failed. At the sight of the pictures, the chief's puzzlement turned into astonishment. As he thumbed the pages of one of the magazines, he became more and more excited. He recognized the Cayapo Indians. We had chosen magazines with photographs of Mato Grosso Indians in them. He greeted them with a loud clicking of his tongue, murmuring scornfully and that they were bad warriors. The Quiapo tribes and are for the most part hostile, courageous Indians. They inhabit a considerable area in the north of the Mato Grosso state, between the rivers Xingu and Aragua. In some parts there are tribes, or rather remnants of tribes, Azavants and Zarantes, blood brothers by kinship and intermarriage with the former. The chief's excitement spread to his sons, captains, and wives. We were soon surrounded by his whole family and his most important henchmen. The intention we had in mind in producing the magazine was dissolving into a cloud of hatred. Everybody, including the women who had first laughed at the photographs because they didn't think much of the painting and adornments of the other tribes, were grave-faced now and sullen at the sight of their natural enemies. Suddenly a captain said something and rushed out. Another did the same. The chief's son took down their bows and arrows from where they hung on poles supported against the inside covering of the hut. From outside could be heard the sound of rushing footsteps, and one of the captains who had recently left us came in again. He was carrying his combat spear, the kind they fashioned roughly out of the root of a certain tree, and which is abandoned after they have used it to kill an enemy. "Do you know where they are?" They thought the Kayapo were near, and they were getting ready to go out and kill them. Before I replied, I took a good look at the faces of the warriors. They had not changed. They were just the same, except that perhaps they were frowning a little and their eyes gleamed brighter. Unable to account for the sensation, I felt somehow proud of being among these fellows. I told them I did not know where the Kayapo were. They were very far away, I said, something like 30 days' journey, at a warrior's pace. That pace meant anything between 37 and 63 miles daily, for such is the distance usually covered in a single day by Zavant warriors, while the pace of the women would be some 19 miles a day. My answer made them laugh and pull back their bowstrings in scorn. They were jeering at the Kayapo for not daring to come any nearer. I was in a dilemma how to explain why I knew so much about the Kayapo, but I need not have worried. They accepted the situation as perfectly natural. They knew themselves to be strong and well prepared for war. When they finished looking at the magazines, the captains and the chief's sons were eyeing me with less indifference. The incident had given me a certain importance in their estimation. Now that the chief showed signs of being calmer, I pointed to the sign camera and then the magazines. His comment was truly extraordinary. He said, "This is a bow for hunting, and these are your specimens of game." What I might have tried hopelessly to explain, the chief had grasped intuitively and expressed with perfect simplicity. I hastened to assure him that these specimens were bad ones, with which he was disposed to agree, and that I hoped to obtain some better ones among the Zavants. With his extraordinary dynamic, he then invited me to hunt him. We went into the center of the village, and Norma filmed the two of us together. This was to be a historic photograph, not only for the uniqueness of the picture itself, but because it signalized the initiation of something I had come to believe was an impossibility.